program, and then they were like, will you marry us? And they were boyfriend and girlfriend. And they were young. I mean, they were like 21, 22. Like, I was young at that church, and even I thought they were and I was like, well, sure, you know, kind of thinking. They were like, what do we need to do? I was like, well, you need to get the license from the state. And I didn't think much of it because, okay. And then literally 2 weeks later, they show up with the license. You know, and they're like, can you marry us? Like, we're going to have it this Saturday. Like, I was like, and it was actually quite an ethical. Well, it doesn't work that way. Like, it was actually quite an ethical dilemma. It's like, they were a mess in many ways. You know, and I was like, not sure it was the right thing to marry them. They were the retired pastor. Why? Well, because they've already got the license, so somebody's going to marry them. You know, because it's either going to be you who actually cares about them, or it's going to be some random judge who doesn't care whether they believe in Jesus or not. You know, so it's got to be you because you're the only person who cares. You know.
I'm sure that wasn't very comforting.
No, it wasn't.
I wouldn't have found it comforting.
No, I didn't. So. I did marry them that Saturday. They're still together, kind of on again, off again, but they're still together.
All right, can you hear me, Steve?
I need
Steve, just let me know if you can hear me. And you have the slide feeding, or do you have us?
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Okay, that sounds on.
Yeah, it's on in-house. And is it on? I'm waiting for Steve to say, I can hear you.
Testing. Steve, can you hear us? Is anybody out there?
I just feel like another brick in the wall.
I'm glad you caught that. I was like, is anybody going to catch that? I don't even like Pink Floyd all that much, actually.
All right.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Is somebody? We're waiting
Steve,
for.
Steve can hear us.
Steve can hear us?
Yes.
Hear and see?
And if Steve can hear and see,
then we're good.
We're good to go.
Welcome, everybody, to Live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I am the pastor.
I am the recovering heretic.
Welcome, Dan.
And to you, my brother.
How's it going?
I am actually, it's going really well.
Good.
Yeah, it's just going really well.
Okay, good.
and the idea for today's topic has never occurred to me before, but today's gospel reading, you know, about the way Jesus gave so many, very detailed instructions on what these disciples were supposed to do, actually made me wonder, you know, it's very clear he's running an organization here.
He is, yes.
And, you know, so it's Jesus as CEO.
Yep.
So in a sense today, divinity gets cast aside.
Okay.
This is just Jesus as the secular CEO.
Okay.
Let's start with the size of his operation.
How big is it?
Because in here, you know, you always, as a kid, you know, it's always about the 12 apostles. So
right.
As you grow up, you kind of think, well, it's Jesus and these 12 guys, and they're just this ragtag band.
Yeah.
And they can just kind of beg where they go, no structure.
Yeah.
They're just chilling. And little stories like when they're crossing the field and they're just kind of eating by grabbing bits of grain.
Yeah.
Again, just sounds like this low-key ragtag group.
Right.
But then we get these 70 disciples today.
Question by Charlie Courier.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
New technology, Charlie Courier.
Charlie Courier. I love it. 70 disciples get sent out today.
Yep.
How many disciples did he actually have? How big was Jesus Incorporated?
How big is the group?
Yeah.
So there's different levels. I guess I would. At Pentecost Day, there's
I think it's 150 in the upper room.
Just in the upper room.
In the compound waiting for Pentecost.
Yeah.
There's 150 if you want to think about it.
And so again, that's just the people there. There were probably others.
There were tons out in the crowd, and it says 3,000 get baptized. But if you're thinking about like the core group that's the church at that point on the day of Pentecost, it's 150, that the tongues of fire come down on and things like that. So there's that. So there's the apostles, which are the 12, right?
And I assume they're like the VPs.
Yeah, and even within them, there's clearly an inner circle, and the inner circle is Peter, James, and John, maybe Andrew, depending on how you. But those are like the three. They're always around Jesus. They're the ones up on the mountain of transfiguration.
Yeah.
They're the ones in the garden.
So they're like the C-suite. So it's Jesus.
Yeah, the three.
Then the
Peter,
three.
James, and John.
And then the executive vice presidents.
Right, and then there's the other 12, the other 9, right?
Yeah.
So, and then from there, we hear the 70 here, right? So there's clearly at least 70. Again, by the time we get to Pentecost, I kind of work backwards from Pentecost, right? So there's 150 at Pentecost. So we've got to get from Andrew telling Peter, come and see, to 150.
Yeah.
And you got to kind of trace the road. So we get the rest of the 12,
Now, and the rest of the 12, are they specialized? Like Judas was the CFO, right? The chief financial officer.
Yeah, there's clearly some roles right. So like the only ones we really hear are that inner circle, and even that, it doesn't say they're an inner circle, just they're always
the ones that are there.
Right.
Yeah.
They're always. It's clear. It's implied that they're an inner circle because, again, they're there at Transfiguration. They're there in the garden. They're there.
Yeah.
Like Peter's the one who says you're the leader. Peter's kind of leadership of this group, right? And then it says Judas kept the public treasure, the public money. So he's the treasurer of the church. And so there's a role there too, right? And so I don't know if the others had roles like that, or what their roles were like that, So, and then the rest of the size of the group kind of varies. It's different at different points. Sometimes it's larger. It's a pretty large crowd at the moment when Jesus is doing the Sermon on the Mount. It's a very large crowd, thousands, right? Or there's the feeding of the 5,000. So there's this large crowd that tries to find Jesus periodically in the Gospels.
Yeah.
So that's a very big group. And then somewhere between that very big group and the apostles is a collection of people we don't get too much details on. So like this is where Mary and Martha and Lazarus kind of fall. They support Jesus. It seems like Mary and Martha can kind of act like home base, or like shelter when they need it.
Yeah. So it's like Mary and Martha and Lazarus are providing the Jesus HQ.
Yeah, well, right, HQ, or like, in the movie Twister, right, Aunt May, who they can always
They know they can always go there.
Right, they know they can always go there. That's what Mary and Martha are. It's thought that Mary and Martha also provided some financial support. There's no evidence of that, or there's no textual place that it says it, but it would fit with how the early church worked. And, they could probably do something like that, some of that financial support that the movement would need.
Yeah. So kind of patrons.
Right. Patrons of some kind. And then, when we get to Acts, so there's this moment where they have to replace Judas, and it comes down to two people, Matthias and Justus, but what Peter says is the qualifications has to have been there from the beginning, with us from his baptism to his death and resurrection, and is in good standing with the community, basically. And these two guys qualify for that. So clearly there's a group that's been there the whole time.
Yeah.
That's not just the 12, and some of those people are in that category. And then there's some people like his family, like John, his brother, and things like that.
Now that in itself brings up something. It's cool they had to have qualifications, which again makes us like Jesus Incorporated.
Right.
But
it's a little different, right, though, because it's not like, are you good at the job? It's
right.
Did you know the story?
Right.
Well,
in today's terms, do you know the mission?
Right. Do you know the mission of the organization? Right. And then after that, it's chosen by lot. So they basically roll dice, and whoever.
Yeah. We got two really good candidates.
Right.
I can't decide.
Right.
Yeah.
Flip a coin.
But that saying there from the beginning, from before the baptism to
from the baptism
resurrection.
to his right.
Did I and this may be me just not getting the chronology right, but I always felt like Jesus got baptized first, then shopped around for the 12, and then the other disciples came along. But so was he?
Depends on which gospel you're reading, on the exact chronology there. So yeah, it depends on the chronology.
So he may have been out proselytizing, preaching, and all that before.
Yeah, right.
Now, would that have been, and again, I know this is stretching out and possibly Apocrypha and whatever, but could he have been preaching as a disciple of John before that point, and that's why he was out preaching?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean,
kind of training under John. Maybe.
Yeah, right. It makes sense that in some way, the chronology in Mark tells us that when John is arrested, that's when Jesus starts his thing. So it makes sense that Jesus is either a part of John's movement or knows John's movement enough that knows John's followers, that kind of thing. So it doesn't say it, but that would make, that he knows these guys from John's group, and he kind of takes over not all of, but part of John's organization. And the Gospel of John describes it that way, where basically John the Baptist says, he's over there, and a handful of them are like, okay.
We're going with him.
Right, and John has no problem with that. And I don't know how, John's doing his own thing. But the chronology in Mark is he gets arrested, and then Jesus starts his public ministry. Yeah. So.
Well, there's also that element of, and I don't obviously remember which gospel this one was in, but it's like John sends some of his people over to check up on what's Jesus doing.
So right, and it's clear from the New Testament book of Acts, John's movement survives John. There's other disciples of John, still around by the time of Acts.
So by the time of Acts, we actually have two parallel.
Right, we have two parallel movements. It's actually this moment where some of the apostles basically run into people who have been baptized, but they were baptized by John's followers. And there's this kind of debate about,
is that valid?
Right, did that count? Because blah, blah, blah. And they've got to sort that out. So there is that story, right, too, of John's sitting in jail, and he's like, well, this isn't quite what I had in mind. Yo, cousin, is this actually how it's supposed to go? And Jesus says, yep.
Accept it. Part of the plan. Yeah. Well, and even that in our corporate terminology for this, so basically Jesus is a spin-off of the John mission.
Right, or I don't know if it's quite spin-off, but sometimes a company sets a path that another one then really flies along in.
Yeah.
There are companies where they did it first, and then there's somebody that comes after them that
does it better.
Yeah. And that might be how, I don't know if it's a spin-off, but John sets the road for Jesus, and that's kind of how he thinks about his own work. It's I'm prepping you for the Messiah, Yeah,
it's kind of an adage, Silicon Valley, the high-tech sector is famous for that.
Right.
If you want to be super successful, you don't want to be the first.
You want to be the second.
You want to be the second, right?
Right. And so, right. There's whoever made the first electric car, and then there's Tesla.
Right.
Jesus is that kind of dynamic.
Interesting that concept. is 2,000 years old. It's not just
You
Silicon
never want
Valley.
to. Well, yeah, it depends on what you're aiming to do, right? But
Yeah, Steve says John had a club and Jesus took over.
yeah, right. I mean, or at least hostile take, like merger appropriation.
An M&A, yeah.
Right, like merger and acquisition, like of key assets. It's not even all assets because some of them are still there after he dies, but certain key assets,
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
And again, that's what I like about this
This is
discussion.
very capitalistic language for Jesus.
Yeah, for Jesus it would be.
Yeah.
But there's a practical side to Jesus and how his ministry would have operated that we just never talk about.
Right.
And especially, I think there is some value in it for churches, with churches having dwindling membership, to go back and realize, no, there was a practical side to what Jesus did too.
Right.
So,
Yep.
Renee has actually a very interesting question I kind of wondered about. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like hyperdrive in Star Wars. Mm-hmm. When Jesus traveled between towns, do they, since Star Wars, it's like, they lose all sense. Sometimes they can get from the center of the galaxy, from Coruscant to the Outer Rim in like 5 minutes.
Right.
And other times it takes 5 days.
Right.
Depending on what the plot wants.
Right.
So same thing with Jesus. There's never this sense of time as he's traveling. Right. So she's asking, when Jesus traveled between towns, do they think, did it tend to be like neighbor to neighbor to neighbor town so they could be efficient in coverage? But do they think he was mostly with the apostles, or was he followed by a mass of people?
So it kind of depends. There's a guy who wrote a book about walking in Jesus, and he actually does Mark. For a long time, people thought the path Jesus takes didn't actually happen
in Mark.
In Mark, because it's very, he's here, and then he's here, and then he's here.
So it's kind of haphazard.
Yeah, and everybody thought, nobody can walk that much, And there was this book by a guy who actually did it. He actually walked the exact, thing that, you could do it, actually. Mm-hmm. So it's possible, so let's start there. Whether there's a crowd or not kind of depends from story to story. The Bible describes there are points, especially in the midst of like the healing stories, where there's a like crowd that's kind of perpetually, there's a mass of people perpetually looking for him.
Yeah.
And like Jesus often tries to get away from it.
Yeah.
Right.
And that would make sense, his need to get away if there's always this crowd around.
Thousands of people who press in around you all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like you want to get away from it. So
you need to for your sanity.
Right, you need to for your sanity. And so there's this description of Jesus being like, okay, they're over here, let's go to the other side of the lake. And then that's how they get to a Gentile town, and then the crowd follows them to the other. He's like, oh, he's on the other side of the lake. Like the Beatles, right?
Yeah.
There they are. And then, but sometimes Jesus, like, this is the hard part about Jesus and how big the group is, because the size of the group varies based on what Jesus is doing himself, because sometimes he basically says something on purpose to make the crowd go away. So like, this is the storyline to John chapter 6, where like, he says, you must eat my flesh, and you drink of my blood, to inherit the kingdom of God.
So he knows he's going to gross them out by phrasing it.
Yeah, and like most of the entire crowd leaves, it says at the end of that chapter. And that's actually the context of our gospel acclamation, where we say, Lord, to whom shall we go? Because Jesus asks, it's actually a really sad question. He looks at the apostles and he goes, are you going to leave too? And the Peter finally responds and says, well, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And that's actually the context of that line. And so
it is sad. It makes it very human.
Yeah, it is. And so who's exactly following him and who's not depends from crowd to, story to story even. Sometimes there's a big crowd. Sometimes Jesus has so irritated them they've left. By the time we get to Palm Sunday, like there's at least enough of them to triumphantly enter and disturb the operation. To basically occupy the Temple Mount. is kind of how you got to think about it.
Following up, Renee has a follow-up question. This is the one that's more like hyperspace travel. How far apart were the towns? And typically, now you talked about the guy that did the convoluted course. Did it take days or just hours? You know, like British villages might only be 3 miles apart.
Right. Think more British villages than like our towns. We lose all sense of scale in America because like it's so big. You know, it's a very big country. You know, it's a small place. You know, and these are little. You know, these are little towns in a small place.
Yeah, villages and hamlets.
Right.
Kinda.
Yeah, villages might be too kind a word, right? You know, like 2 houses and an outhouse on the side of a mountain, you know, like kind of thing. Like, so they're all over the place, you know. Right. The close by a normal person can walk like 10, maybe 20 miles in a day. You know, if you want to think of scale of walking.
Okay.
You know.
Now, does that include, is that a normal person with shoes or a normal person who's barefoot or sandaled? Because barefoot and sandaled would slow you down.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
I heard it in the context of, okay, I'll be honest. The context I heard that in was explaining why in The Lord of the Rings, when they take the ferry and the Black Riders have to ride around, why that's a big deal.
Gotcha.
Because it was a 20-mile ride, and you know that's a full day that they gained on the Black Riders.
Gotcha.
So I don't know anything more than I know it from The Lord of the Rings, from a story's
They already know, in this crowd, that's
Right.
acceptable.
Yeah, right, sorry.
That's a legitimate citation. No, but it does still give perspective that they wouldn't have been all that far apart then in that country back
No, right, it's not. And I mean, to this day, right, like this is why you can shoot off, like those rockets the Palestinians shoot off sometimes, they're bottle rockets, you know, basically. Like, and that's why they can hit Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or, you know, like.
because everything's so compact.
Right, it's, you know, the width of Israel is only 20 miles across.
Oh, wow.
Like from the sea to the Jordan River, it's only 20 miles, basically.
Wow.
It's a really narrow strip of land.
So, like, you know, Americans who commute to work, half of them.
Yeah, you've gone the width of you've gone the width of the country. You know, it's a
Wow.
very small. It's not a lot of land. It's a teeny little.
Yeah. I didn't realize it was that small. You're right. Being in the U.S. does really distort my sense of distance.
Yes, it does. Because, right.
Wow. Well, on that, again, distance front, traveling front, today he tells his disciples not to even bring sandals. I can understand not bringing a purse, not bringing valuables. A, won't get stolen.
Yeah.
B, he's obviously trying to teach them to live off the charity.
Right.
Why not sandals? Why wouldn't you wear sandals?
Part of it's a little hyperbole. You know, I mean, there's hyperbole clearly going on here, but Jesus. So first of all, there's a type of person in the ancient world like the traveling wise man, the traveling wise con man, you know, who's like trying to con people into paying him money for his teaching in some way, you know, and so part of Jesus' instructions are practical, like this is how you will differentiate yourself from this person, you know, like because you'll accept whatever they'll give you. You'll be unprepared. You'll be, you know, like this person's looking to game the system. You will accept whatever charity is given you, you know. So that's kind of hyperbole on top of he's trying to differentiate himself from that traveling con man philosopher, you know.
The reality of those times that we don't even have.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's different versions. Like Greece had my favorite, I think I've talked about this before, but Greece had my favorite character of all time, which is the panhandling philosopher who would shout philosophical truths at you and then demand you pay him money, you know.
Yeah. Well, and you were saying even Socrates, who we hold up as this great giant, may have been one of these.
May have been one of these guys, like, or at least he didn't demand money, which irritated people even more. Like you couldn't get him to go, you couldn't pay him to go away. Like he just keep pestering you, you know, like.
teaching you Socratically by asking you questions.
Right, but like, imagine how annoying this guy would be, right? Like, he's at your party and you're like, he's just asking you why you're doing everything you're doing in your life all of a sudden. So there's a wise practice principle of the ancient world that he's doing. It really does seem like it was original to the movement, that it was this differentiated traveling Christian prophets from kind of everything else in the Near East. That it's also probably why we started putting things in book format, actually, is because they kept doing this after the early church, after Jesus died, was ascended into heaven. And books are a lot easier to carry than scrolls. So very early Christian movements are starting to put things in books so that they're portable. So that you're one of these people who's sent out like this. You got the book with you.
Right.
You
don't have to have a backpack filled with scrolls.
Right, yeah, right. You've got a book. It's far more portable.
Yeah.
That seems to be one of the reasons we started literally putting it together, And then, right, it gets to the point where you can even read in Paul's starting to lay down some rules about these people that are sent out like this, where he's like, okay, but, don't be taken in by them,
Yeah.
Because there were clearly some con men started attaching themselves to this. Oh, I'm a Christian prophet, sent out like this. Take care of me,
Which makes sense. I mean, a con artist is going to spot opportunity wherever it is.
Right. So. And so Paul has to start laying down some rules about that.
Yeah. Again, now Jesus Inc., right? Now we're protecting our copyright. We're protecting our brand.
Right. We're protecting our brand, and we're protecting ourselves, right? How do you know this person's actually from corporate, instead of just a joke, right? I mean, I think I said this before we started, but like, everybody always wants to poo-poo organized religion, but like, I'm sorry, it's been an organized religion. Like, people say, can't we get back to just Jesus and not the organized religion part? And I'm like, it's been an organized religion from Jesus on down.
Yeah.
Like it was clearly organized from the beginning.
Well, that's what this discussion is revealing, right?
Yeah.
And it would have to be if you have, like you said, more than 3 followers.
Right.
You got to have some kind of organization.
Right. Anytime there's more than 3 people in a room, you've got organization.
Yeah.
Well, whether it's hierarchical, that's a different question.
Yeah.
But there is organization.
One of the things that he says when you're sending out these 70 disciples is cure the sick while you're there, which obviously implies they can do miracles too.
Yep.
So given that you have these 70 other people on top of Jesus who are performing miracles, why does the Bible focus on Jesus' miracles and not talk about the fact that his followers were also going out? Later on, it does mention, Peter performs this miracle, Paul brings someone back to life.
Peter does that stand-in, right?
But until then,
right, it's
all about Jesus' miracles. And this is like the first mention. They're like, oh yeah, by the way, his followers did it too, even while he was alive.
Yeah. So part of it is, right, like it's done in Jesus' name, right? They have no power in themselves. It's solely Jesus who has the power, right? Which is still true today.
So by invoking him, they then perform miracles.
Like I don't, communion isn't me, right? It's baptism isn't me, it's God who does these things. Yeah. And even real miracles today, it's God who does these things, not any one person.
Yeah. But even as a mechanism, I mean, theologically, is it just they don't want to distract your attention from Jesus? Or?
The Gospels have I guess they have a purpose. I go back to this thing about John, where miracle's almost the wrong word. I think John is right about this because in the Gospel of John, they're always signs, they're not miracles, and so it's very clear from all 4 Gospels, there's stuff that they didn't tell us. But the goal isn't to tell us everything. The goal is to point toward God in Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And so...
Yeah, we want to see them as biographies, give us all the detail.
Right, and like they are an ancient biography, but an ancient biography has a point. Like ancient biographies believed great people had like had a telos to them, had an end, a focus, a teleology we call it. They had a destiny, about them. And the goal of biography was to reveal that destiny, and so the goal here is not to tell you everything Jesus did, because even John says we couldn't write it down, everything that that's how John ends, right? You couldn't fit in one book all the things that he did. I've told you enough so that you believe he is the Son of God. And that's the goal. So like those people's miracles don't help toward that end. They just, the Bible's almost like, who cares? Jesus feeding the 5,000 reveals you is a sign that reveals you something about who God is in Jesus Christ.
Now I'm going to vary, because we're starting to run out of time already, from that theme, because Steve had a question based on Paul's reading today.
Okay.
And he asked, given how Paul really focused on circumcision in this particular passage, was it assumed that people were uncircumcised from the get-go? And also, who checked?
Yeah, I know, right? So, so a couple of things. Only Jews were circumcised in the ancient world.
Okay.
Only. And in a world where you're naked far more often, it was very clear who was Jewish and who wasn't. Like you went to the gym naked in Rome. You go to the gym, everybody knows you're a Jew.
Right there.
Right there. Period. End of story. This is a peculiar, so part of this is a peculiar thing to Galatians, because Galatians is all about this. So the storyline to Galatians, Paul founds this congregation, and then somebody has come along behind Paul and convinced them they all need to be circumcised in order to be Christians, and they're all Gentiles. This is a Gentile congregation. Like, there are no Jews in this congregation, and or at least very little, and so somebody has come along behind Paul and convinced, and after Paul has convinced them, no, to be a part of the God of Israel, all you have to do is have faith in Jesus. Somebody has come along behind Paul and been like, yeah, Paul was wrong about that. You all need to be circumcised. And by extension, keep the food, the code, basically, right? Keep kosher. And so the rest of the book of Galatians is Paul writing about how stupid the Galatians are for believing that. And he actually, Galatians opens up with Paul not giving a thanksgiving. Paul gives a thanksgiving in every other letter except for the Galatians. He is so angry at them.
Wow.
He doesn't even thank God for them. And he opens up by going, I am astounded. And at one point he actually says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?
Wow.
So that reading today is that's the end of the letter. So that's the very end of a letter that's been all about
naughty Galatians.
Well, about Paul asking, why would you do this? Like, what was going through your heads? My mom what were you thinking is what my mom used to ask me. That's what Paul's asked. Like, what were you thinking? Why would you, after I told you needed nothing other than faith in order to be a part of the people of God, why would you believe you needed something more?
That you got to go through this checklist.
What did they say to you that convinced you that you needed more? What convinced you were incomplete, in God's eyes?
So is that the relevance of him pointing out to them that he's writing in big, bold letters? Is that our equivalent of texting in all caps?
Yeah, no. So that's, Paul typically sometimes does this. He'll say, I write in my own hand. Paul used a stenographer, somebody to dictate for him. And so he would dictate and somebody would write it down. And then towards the end of the letters, he sometimes takes the pen out of their hand and goes, just to prove to you this is actually me, see, the font's changed. It is, here I am, I'm serious. This isn't somebody else pretending to be me. It's me.
It's me. Yours sincerely, Paul.
Right, which is what he's saying there. So that's the conclusion to it. So circumcision is a stand-in in the early church for its effect. where Lutherans have gone with it is it's a works righteousness argument. Do you need to do something to be a part of the people of God or not? And then the answer is no.
Yeah. But this is, for clarity, this is also at a time when Christianity was still considered
Jewish.
Yes, just a sect of Judaism.
Right. So Paul's at the Paul's at the radical side of ministry here, and so Paul's always facing this. We don't know who these people are, but they're people who come along behind Paul and basically tell him he's wrong, or basically say to the congregation, and Paul's always writing against these people in one form or another. So there were breakoffs and divisions in the church even back then.
Yeah.
So who knows who they are?
And again, just like today's corporations, right? You have a very dynamic leader, CEO,
right?
And when he or she leaves, sometimes the corporation starts to fall apart.
Well, very quickly after he left, it starts being organized more along a franchise operation setup. So this is where the role of bishop actually comes from. Bishop means overseer in Greek, literally. And used to be the bishops were the elders of the congregation, it seemed like. And then gradually over time, there come to be three roles: bishops, presbyters, and deacons. And the bishop is the central guy in a city, and then the presbyters are the priests. That's me. I'm a presbyter.
Okay.
And then under that were the deacons. But each city, there wasn't really a centralized, like we would think of the Vatican today. It was each city had kind of authority in their cities, and that was kind of it. And periodically they disagree with each other, and periodically they'd excommunicate each other, and but it was far more of a franchise operation, where there's certain general basics, right? You got to have on the menu to be a McDonald's thing, but a lot of it's determined by owner.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the setup gradually, and it became more centralized over time. Over time, 5 different bishoprics start to become centralized. And that's Rome, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople. What's Istanbul today?
Yeah.
And those 5 begin to exert more authority over the others. But
incidentally, today's the day that Constantine beat his co-emperor.
Oh, it's today the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, right? Yeah. So see, and so, but that develops over time, and that takes thousands of years to kind of flesh out the organizational principle there. So,
cool.
Yep.
And we are now out of time.
All right.
So I think we covered quite a bit of corporate Jesus.
Right. Jesus it's an anarchist movement, but it is an organized movement.
Yeah.
It's a direct action movement. It's got direct action campaigns. And kind of everything Jesus does, you can kind of look at them as in cycles of direct action campaigns. Think of Martin Luther King's direct action campaigns. It's a similar thing. They're very public things toward a very direct, challenging goal.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
Yep.
Fits.
Yep.
Thank you. Liked it. Thanks, Steve and Renee, for questions.
Yep.
And we'll see you next week, right?
Yep, next week.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Now we can be like